Hello, everyone. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. You're listening to Healing Outside the Box. This is episode 206, and I'm calling it A Look at Rapid Eye Movement Therapy. Now, I don't know if you've seen the TV series called The Affair, but in the last season, this central character underwent this type of therapy. It's called EMDR. She had undergone a traumatic event, namely the sudden death of her son from drowning. In one particular episode, they showed the therapist using this rapid eye movement therapy to help her cope with that terrible trauma. It was certainly interesting to see all this unfold on TV, but does it work in real life? One way to grab myself an opinion on the subject is to simply try it myself. So I did. 5 sessions worth to be exact. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's define the terms so everyone knows what we're talking about. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, is a psychotherapy technique that helps people heal from a traumatic event or events. EMDR processing may often be directed at specific childhood traumas that may manifest itself in adults as poor decision-making or depression. This treatment usually goes on over a relatively short period of time. The length of the treatment may depend on the number of traumas or the severity of the PTSD symptoms. Now, if we are to believe Sigmund Freud, and I'm not sure that I do, we would assume that it takes years of psychotherapy to reduce the emotional pain of traumatic childhood memories. But here's the thing. We simply don't know what we don't know. This theory is basically that emotional trauma can potentially heal in a way that is similar to physical trauma. If you cut your hand or fracture your wrist, your body wants to heal itself. We all know that. But if the open cut gets repeatedly dosed with bacteria or the fracture is not set properly, the wounds won't heal. Sympathy or prayers won't heal those wounds if they keep getting reinfected with the bacteria. The body needs to be allowed to heal properly. It may just be that the brain heals in a similar way, or potentially heals, I should say. If the brain's ability to heal is, say, blocked or repeatedly imbalanced by depression or drugs or self-defeating behavior, the brain can't forget the trauma. And this is theoretically because the brain stays in survivor mode. In the psychology biz, they call this a survival brain. If, say, a World War II veteran that barely survived a POW camp might freeze in terror when he hears a German shepherd barking, that doesn't mean that he's actually been bitten by a German shepherd. It means that the sound of that German shepherd barking angrily triggers the memory of a trauma. So what EMDR attempts to do is remove the block so that the brain can heal. When the trauma happens, your thinking brain, or frontal lobe, shuts down and your fight or flight brain is stimulated. That's deep into the center of your brain. PTSD occurs when the brain is unable to reset itself and your frontal lobe, which is trying to make sense out of new things, cannot function properly. So the brain can no longer distinguish between what is safe and unsafe. Now, this EMDR is considered to be a holistic therapy that integrates different therapies in order to treat specific traumatic experiences. There are now over 100,000 therapists, even though it just started around 1990. Now, it might seem like it's a fad, and it very well may be a fad. But I think that it is gaining in popularity because people are feeling better. And they're feeling better in a relatively short period of time. And unlike drowning your sorrows in a bottle of booze, which succeeds in making you feel numb in the evening, but not so great in the morning, there doesn't seem to be any side effects. Based on what little I know, the theory of EMDR may be similar to that of hypnosis. Namely, that the traumatic event needs to be brought up and processed in order to diminish the distressing thoughts around it. If you want to see an example of how EMDR is conducted, I'm going to leave you a few links in the show notes that you can watch on YouTube. The first of these is a 16-minute video that gives you a breakdown on the different symptoms of PTSD, and it also shows you a quick demonstration at the end. It's a good video for health professionals that want to get a feeling for the definitions around EMDR. The second video is a more detailed demonstration of the EMDR technique. In a nutshell, EMDR uses bilateral eye movements that are similar to eye movements in REM sleep. The theory is that this stimulates both parts of the brain to desensitize the trauma. Then EMDR seeks to reprogram the areas related to the traumatic memory with some positive thinking. EMDR therapy is an 8-phase treatment. Eye movements or bilateral stimulation, such as tapping, are used during phase 4. After the clinician has determined which memory to target first, he or she asks the client to hold different aspects of that event in their mind and then use their eyes to track the therapist's hand as it moves back and forth. As this happens, I guess for reasons thought to be connected with the biological mechanisms involved in REM sleep, internal associations arise and the clients begin to process the memory and the disturbing feelings. If EMDR therapy is successful, the goal is to see traumatic events in a less distressing way. For instance, a rape victim shifts from feeling horror and self-disgust to holding the firm belief that I survived it and I am strong. So as I mentioned, I experienced this EMDR for myself, and I'll go through the different descriptions of the 8 phases and describe my experience as I go along. Phase 1. History and readiness for change. The therapist and client work together to identify memories that cause emotional distress and to develop a treatment plan. In my case, I had a traumatic event in my childhood that I think causes me to overreact to constructive criticism. So this is what we agreed to work on. Phase 2. The client is reminded that there are many different ways of handling stress. Different calming techniques are discussed with the client. You could also call this options for stress management. In my case, I've used TM as my stress reduction technique of choice. TM is Transcendental Meditation, and I had a previous episode on this, which I'll add to the show notes. The goal of this EMDR therapy is to produce rapid and effective change, while at the same time the client maintains stress reduction between sessions. Okay, phases 3 through 6. These steps involve the rapid eye movement processing. The client describes a visual image of the trauma. The client identifies a negative belief about themselves as a result of the trauma. The client may rate how they feel on a scale of 1 to 7. In other words, how true this belief feels. The client makes an association between the trauma and the negative belief. An example of this might be, say, an incest victim engaging in self-destructive behavior that doesn't at first glance seem to be related. The client may then be asked to describe any bodily sensations as well. The client may be asked if there is a visual image related to this memory or a specific emotion that comes up. Then the client might be encouraged to think about the visual image in a more positive way. In my case, I didn't have any bodily sensations, but I did relate a story that happened a few years ago. I had to fire a woman that worked for me because I found out she had taken my credit card and charged over $2,000 worth of merchandise and then sent it to her brother's house. As I look back, I should have known that she wouldn't plead guilty and say how sorry she was, and she didn't. Instead, she wrote the word BITCH across my outside front door in big letters. I actually had to hire and pay someone to remove the lettering. But more damaging than that was the fact that I suddenly believed everybody was agreeing with her. If someone is willing to write that word in big letters on my front door, then it must be true. My therapist then said, after hearing this, "Is it possible that there's another way to look at this? That this, perhaps, is solely about that other woman and not about you?" Then, in Phase 4, there are several sets of REM exercises. It's called bilateral stimulation. The client is instructed to think about the visual image or negative belief. Then the counselor moves his or her fingers back and forth quickly in front of the client's eyes and asks the client to follow his or her fingers. This is done for about 15 seconds. After that, the client is asked to take a deep breath and then think about what is going on in the client's mind. This cycle is then repeated with perhaps a suggestion from the counselor regarding a positive self-image. In phases 5 and 6, the client is asked to think about the traumatic event, and then if it can be accessed without distress or fear. The focus is on strengthening the positive idea that gets expressed during the process. In phase 7, the therapist assures the client that processing can continue even though the distress with the painful memory has subsided. If the client wishes, he or she can make a log during the week before the next session. In other words, documenting any related material that may come up during the week. The record keeping serves to remind the client of self-calming activities that may have been learned during the session. In my case, I didn't bother with the log, but it was only given as an option. Phase 8 is the following session, which involves looking at any progress that has been made thus far. Discussion may center around preparing for future events that might trigger similar emotional responses. In my case, when I picture those words on my outside front door, I now imagine myself as a spectator walking by someone's house and seeing derogatory terms towards, say, an African American or a Jewish person written in big letters on their doors. Would I think, "Oh, that person living inside must have deserved that"? Or would I think, "Some crazy-ass person just wrote that nasty thing on the person's front door"? Now, my subjective opinion on this EMDR is that this processing has helped me and I'd recommend it to others. But what do the objective studies show? I looked around the internet and I pulled out a few studies. Some of the studies show that 84 to 90% of single trauma victims no longer have post-traumatic stress disorder after only 3 90-minute sessions. But no long-term studies have been done checking in on those same people after 12 or 18 months. Even after saying that, those are pretty dramatic numbers. Almost seems too good to be true. In another study, they said that 77% of combat veterans were free of PTSD in only 12 sessions. Kinda crazy. There is currently enough research on EMDR that it is now recognized as an effective form of treatment for trauma and other disturbing experiences by organizations like the American Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization. Since it is now recognized as an effective treatment for trauma, you can see how EMDR therapy would also be effective in treating the everyday traumatic memories, which might explain some of the reasons why people have low self-esteem or feelings of powerlessness. Could this be the placebo effect at work? Or maybe the client wants to please the therapist so much that he or she assures the therapist that it was successful. I'm not sure about the answer to that. What I am sure about is that any tool in the toolbox that has no downside, no side effects, and potentially can improve anyone's psychological health is worthy of a second look. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.